Tudor Travel Guide's A to Z of Tudor places. I'm Sarah and I'm the Tudor Travel Guide, and it's great to have you back here. So today we are heading eastwards into the glorious county of Suffolk. In fact, it's one of my favourite counties in England to visit for its Tudor history. And today we are going to be exploring a place that was once the centre of power for one of the most aristocratic families in Tudor England. That's Framlingham Castle, ancestral seat to the Howard family, the Dukes of Norfolk. Now, I think that to stand in the centre of Framlingham Castle, surrounded by its nearly 900-year-old walls, is to stand in a place where a renewed Catholic era dawned over England. For it was there, in July 1553, that the Lady Mary, daughter of Henry VIII, learnt that she had been accepted by the Royal Council and country as the rightful Queen of England, following the death of her younger brother, Edward VI, some 2 weeks previously. Mary's long road of rejection and struggle appeared to finally be at an end. And as a visitor to Framlingham, that moment of relief still feels palpable, as if it's been imprinted in the fabric of the castle walls. So, if you want to get up close and personal to a defining moment in Tudor history, then a trip to Framlingham should definitely feature on one of your Tudor travels. But Mary I's association with the castle was in fact predated by a long and illustrious history, particularly in relation to the mighty and somewhat imperious Howard family. And before we talk more about the Howards at Framlingham, perhaps I'll give you a little potted history of the castle's early origins. Now, Framlingham Castle was built by the Bigod family in the 12th century, with the present masonry curtain walls and towers replacing an earlier castle on the site, thought to have been built circa 1100. Now, this castle was built by Roger Bigod, and he was a Norman who had come over to England with William the Conqueror. Now, this chappie served the new English king faithfully as Sheriff of Norfolk and clearly enjoyed the reward of his loyalty. And although he was not a noble, he was granted the manor of Framlingham. However, it was Roger's grandson who built the current castle towards the end of the 12th century. Now, to cut quite a convoluted story short, the castle passed back and forth between private ownership and the crown until 1397, when a certain Thomas Mowbray was made Duke of Norfolk. The title of the Duke of Norfolk then passed to the Howard family by marriage, John Howard becoming the first Howard to hold the title of Duke of Norfolk. And it is he who is thought to have carried out extensive repairs to and a great deal of refurbishment around the castle site. Unfortunately for John, though, he was killed at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 whilst leading the Yorkist cause under his sovereign Richard III. Now, although he was on the losing side, the Howards gradually began their climb back into royal favour and regained, ultimately, the Dukedom of Norfolk. And Thomas Howard, who was John's son, was ultimately made the second Duke of Norfolk. Now, for those of you who like to join up the family dots, it is the Thomas Howard who was father to Elizabeth Howard, Anne Boleyn's mother. And it is this Thomas who is thought to have undertaken much of the Tudor refurbishment at Framlingham Castle, and this included the remodelling of the gatehouse, whose doors, which incredibly are still in place today, are authentically of the period. Dendrochronology has shown that the timber was most likely felled during the period 1496 to 1528. That just blows my mind. Anyway, he also added these red bricked chimneys, which you can still see around Framlingham Castle and which are so iconic of the Tudor period. They survive intact to this day. Now, Thomas died at Framlingham Castle in 1524 at the ripe old age of 80. Wow! And he was buried at the nearby Priory of Thetford following a lavish funeral. And after the second Duke's death, his son, also confusingly called Thomas, retained Framlingham, but chose to live at the newly built Kenninghall in Norfolk, a far more fashionable and comfortable manor house of its day. And if you're interested in hearing more about Kenninghall, you can follow the link to my blog where you can read more about this fascinating house, or indeed the link which will also be in the description below to hear me interview Nikki Clark, historian and expert on the Howards and Kenninghall, for my podcast, The Tudor Travel Show. Both links in the description below. Anyway, back to our story. So, the third Duke, Thomas Howard, uncle to Anne Boleyn, narrowly avoided execution in the dying days of Henry VIII's reign, although the Howard title and the lands were, as you might expect, surrendered to the crown. Hence, in 1552, Mary Tudor was able to inherit Framlingham, having been granted the Howard estates in East Anglia by her brother, Edward VI. Now, sadly, around 1 year later, Edward VI died on the 6th of July, 1553, and here started a dramatic struggle for power. Mary was summoned to London by the Duke of Northumberland and the Regency Council. However, as she rode there, she was tipped off that this was a plot to seize her and thereby ensure that Mary would not be able to rally the country to declare in her favour. Northumberland had other plans. He, meanwhile, declared his daughter-in-law, the Protestant Lady Jane Grey, Queen of England. The Lady Mary took flight, heading towards her estates in Suffolk, eventually arriving at the stronghold of Framlingham on the 12th of July. Now, by the time Mary reached Framlingham, she had amassed about 15,000 men in her retinue, with numbers increasing daily, boosted by, and I quote, I can't even say the word, innumerable small companies of common people, unquote. Northumberland's campaign, as we know, floundered and ended with his surrender. The Earl of Arundel and Lord Paget rode in post to the Queen, taking with them 30 horses. They arrived on Thursday the 20th of July, and on bended knee informed Mary that she had been proclaimed Queen in London. By the will of the people, conflict was avoided. Mary Tudor, now Queen of England, left Framlingham in triumph on Monday the 24th of July, travelling to London to be crowned on the 1st of October 1553. So now we know about the history of Framlingham, let's take a little tour and explore how the castle looked during the 16th century, and indeed what can still be seen today. So the entrance to the castle is across a bridge and through those mighty wooden gates that I was talking about earlier, and this leads you into the inner bailey or courtyard. Now, in the 16th century, the entire courtyard would have been surrounded by buildings. The closest to the gateway on the left and the right were largely single-storey service buildings, with the main high-status buildings surrounding the distant half of the courtyard. Of these high-status buildings, the Great Hall was on the left. Now, it has since been replaced by the old poorhouse, which was built in 1729, but it still incorporates some of the fabric of the old medieval hall. Then running at right angles from the far end of the hall, and in fact if you look carefully you can still see the ragged end of the wing projecting out from the side of the poorhouse, which is today is the shop and the restaurant, etc. This privy range was a two-storey range which ran across the top end of the courtyard, and it connected the hall on one side with the main living block, the chamber block, on the opposite side of the castle. Now this latter structure comprised of the private lodgings of the lord and his family. If the same arrangement of chambers applied here at Framlingham as any other major house of its day, we can perhaps assume that this connecting range contained the other principal public chambers of the household, including a watching chamber and a presence chamber, where receptions and ceremonies would have taken place. But this range is sadly now entirely lost, and little seems to be known about the rooms contained therein for sure. However, more is known about the chamber block, as some of its structural features have been left literally imprinted into the wall of the castle, which you will see if you visit today. It is these buildings that were constructed on the orders of Thomas Howard, the second Duke. He seems to have been mainly responsible for upgrading and turning the lodgings of the medieval castle into a more fashionable Tudor residence. And built of stone, the two-storey chamber block had, and I quote, grand windows, one of the windows being opened up to create a door that led out to a bridge beyond, and that allowed access to the private garden in the bailey outside the castle walls. And it would have been in these rooms that Mary Tudor spent those anxious few days awaiting news from London and other towns across England, which as time passed gradually began to declare in her favour. There was also a chapel which adjoined the chamber block, and that sat at right angles to it on a conventional east-west axis. And if you visit today, you can easily make out its high east window built into the castle's curtain wall, with an area for an altar below it. Now it is said that upon hearing of her proclamation as Queen, Mary led her household to Mass, where a celebratory Te Deum was sung. One of the most outstanding features, I think, of the castle today is that you can still walk around almost the entire circuit of the castle walls. And this gives wonderful views across the adjacent town of Framlingham and the surrounding countryside, including the famous Mere. And make sure you don't miss the pillars that once supported the bridge that led from the chamber block across into the Tudor garden, and which would have been laid out with herbs and fruit trees and fountains. Bliss. Now, one more thing to consider if you do visit Framlingham, and it's so important. Do not forget to take in the local church of St Michael the Archangel, which is just down the road from the castle. Now, when Thetford Priory was dismantled following the dissolution of the monasteries, Framlingham Church became the Howard Mausoleum. And today there are some extremely fine and fascinating Tudor tombs to be found there. Those of the 3rd Duke of Norfolk and probably his first wife Anne, Henry Howard and his wife Frances de Vere, as well as the tomb of Henry Fitzroy and the fascinating Mary Howard, Duke and Duchess, of course, of Richmond. And the church is just a stone's throw away from the castle and is easy to spot. And in all, I'd say that Framlingham Castle is a giant in Tudor history, both in terms of its size and the significance of the events which unfolded there around 450 years ago. It is a place to soak up history, and so if you are visiting the area, make sure it's on your itinerary. Oh, and by the way, if you are looking for some wonderful Tudor places to stay in Suffolk, then check out my blogs on Westow Hall near Bury St Edmunds and the Swan at the pretty medieval town of Lavenham. And links to both these blogs are, of course, included in the description below. Before we go, there is of course time for my Tudor Rose rating for Framlingham Castle and Church, based on, as you probably remember, 4 different criteria. The first of these is historical importance. Well, I give it, hands down, 5 Tudor Roses. The exchange of power from one sovereign to another doesn't happen often, and as this is the place that Mary finally inherited her birthright and began to try and restore Catholicism to England, well, on that basis, Framlingham Castle has to take its place right up there in Tudor history. Secondly, the wow factor at Framlingham. Well, I would give it 4.5 Tudor Roses. I'm a big fan of castles, and this one is stunning and on the whole well preserved. A nearby walk from the castle, detailed in my digital mini guide, Your Tudor Weekend Away in Suffolk, which I will give a link to in the description. Well, that walk gives glorious views of the castle across the mere, which on a still day is famously, or the reflection of the castle is famously perfectly reflected in the water. However, it's not only the castle which earns its high rating. The Tudor tombs, part of the Howard Mausoleum, are absolutely among the finest in the country. I can literally remember going into the church and going, wow, 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 when I first saw them. I give the tombs alone 5 Tudor Roses. The third factor, authenticity. Yep, 5 Tudor Roses. The castle may not be complete, but what is there is vintage, as are the tombs. Need I say more? And then finally, accessibility. Well, the castle has good opening hours through the season, and you can see its grandeur and access to shop and facilities from within the courtyard. The church, of course, is open all year round, and again, the tombs are at ground floor level. I take only 1 Tudor Rose away, as if you are disabled, I suspect there's no way to access the walk around the ramparts of the castle. So on accessibility, it's 4 Tudor Roses from me. Anyway, that brings us to the end of today's A to Z. I hope you've enjoyed this month's feature on Framlingham Castle, and remember that links to everything that I have mentioned will be in the description below this video. So I look forward to seeing you on our next Tudor road trip and for our next A to Z adventure next month. But in the meantime, of course, as ever, there is only one thing for me to say, and that is happy time travelling.